The year was 1887, and the land Arthur Blackwood bought was a testament to failure. It was 160 acres of Montana prayer and disappointment, tucked into a shallow valley where the wind came to die, a mournful death. The homestead itself was a skeleton picked clean by neglect. The cabin sagged like an old man's spine. Its windows were vacant eyes staring at nothing, and the barn leaned with the heavy shame of collapse. This suited Arthur just fine. He had not come here seeking prosperity. He had come seeking a place to bury what was left of his soul. He was a man carved from absence. The wide-open spaces of his life, once filled with the warmth and low laughter of his wife, Martha, were now just hollow echoes. She had been gone for 5 years, taken by a fever that followed the stillbirth of their son. The two losses had braided themselves into a single, unyielding knot in his chest. The doctor, a man with kind eyes and a weary voice, had later told him, after a persistent ailment of his own, that Martha's death had likely spared him a different kind of heartbreak. The chances of him siring another child were, the doctor had said gently, slim to none, a dead end, a line that finished with him. And so, Arthur, a man who had once dreamed of sons with his eyes and daughters with his wife's smile, had become a ghost, haunting his own life. He sold his small, successful ranch, the one he and Martha had built together, and drifted, finally washing up on the shores of this forgotten claim, a place as barren as he felt. His days fell into a rhythm of punishing labor. From the first gray hint of dawn until the sky bruised into nightfall, he worked. He did not work with the hope of creation, but with the desperation of erasure. He mended fences that enclosed nothing of value, hauled fallen timbers from the barn for a fire he barely felt, and patched the roof of the cabin just enough to keep the worst of the weather out. He ate standing up, hardtack and jerky, his thoughts a low, constant hum of what might have been. The silence of the place was immense, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk or the ceaseless sighing of the wind through the pines. It was a silence he had craved, a silence that matched the vast emptiness inside him. He had paid for the land with the last of his money, a transaction that felt less like a purchase and more like an act of surrender. He had bought himself a grave with a view. For 2 weeks, this was his existence. A cycle of work, exhaustion, and dreamless sleep. He had explored the property only enough to understand the scope of its decay. The main cabin, the barn, a crumbling smokehouse. He had paid little mind to the root cellar, its heavy slanted doors swollen shut and half buried by seasons of dirt and weeds. He had no need of it. He had nothing to store, nothing to preserve, for a future he had no intention of welcoming. But a cold snap, sudden and vicious, changed his routine. It arrived overnight, a harbinger of the brutal winter to come, frosting the dead grass in a layer of silver and turning his breath into plumes of smoke. The water in his bucket was filmed with ice. It was the kind of cold that found its way through the chinks in the logs he had yet to properly seal. As he worked to shore up the cabin's foundation, his gaze fell upon the cellar doors. A thought, practical and unbidden, broke through his fog of grief. If the cold was this sharp on the surface, the earth below might offer a more constant, less brutal temperature. It might be a place to store his meager supplies, to keep them from freezing solid. With a grunt, he drove the head of a pickaxe into the soil around the doors, chipping away at the hard-packed earth. The wood was waterlogged and heavy. It took the better part of an hour, his muscles screaming in the frigid air, to pry one of the doors open enough to peer into the darkness below. A smell wafted out damp earth, mildew, and something else. Something living. He froze, his hand still on the warped wood. He listened, straining against the whine of the wind. A rustle, a faint, terrified whimper quickly shushed. It was not an animal. He had spent his life on the land. He knew the sounds of prairie dogs and coyotes, of badgers and snakes. This was human. His first thought was of vagrants, maybe a desperate man on the run. His hand instinctively went to the Colt holstered at his hip. He drew it, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand. "Whoever's down there, come on out," he called, his voice a rough crackle from disuse. The only answer was a deeper silence, a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. He pulled the door open further, letting a weak shaft of grey daylight pierce the gloom. A set of steep, earthen steps led down into the black. He descended cautiously, his boots sinking slightly into the dirt floor. As his eyes adjusted, the shapes began to resolve themselves from the shadows. Sections. They were not vagrants. They were children. 3 of them, huddled in the farthest corner against a wall of stone and earth, wrapped in a threadbare collection of blankets and rags. The eldest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 14, was on her feet in an instant. She shoved the 2 smaller children behind her, her body a frail but defiant shield. In her hand, she clutched a sharpened piece of a broken shovel handle, its rusty point aimed directly at his heart. Her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with a terror so fierce it was nearly feral. Behind her, a boy of about 10 peered around her hip, his expression not of fear, but of a solemn, unnerving watchfulness. And peeking from the folds of the blankets on the ground was the smallest one, a little girl with a tangle of pale hair and eyes that were 2 pools of pure fright. Arthur stopped, the Colt still in his hand, feeling suddenly obscene and heavy. The air in the cellar was thick with their fear. He could feel it, a palpable thing, cold and sharp as the air outside. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hand and holstered the pistol. The girl with the spear did not relax. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, clumsy and inadequate. The girl said nothing. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her makeshift weapon. Her gaze darted from his face to his hands, then back again, assessing, waiting. "This is my property now," he stated, his tone flatter than he intended. It was a fact, simple and hard. "What are you doing here?" It was the boy who answered, his voice quiet but clear. "This was our home." Arthur looked around the dark, damp hole. This was no home. This was a place to hide. He thought of the derelict cabin, the collapsed barn. He remembered the weathered, unreadable names on the 2 simple wooden crosses in the overgrown plot behind the cabin. Hale. He looked back at the children. He was standing in the middle of a story he did not understand, a complication he did not want. His carefully constructed solitude had just been breached by 3 pairs of haunted eyes. He turned without another word and climbed the steps back into the biting wind. He left the cellar door ajar, a concession he couldn't explain, and walked back to the cabin. The silence he had cultivated now felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. That night, the blizzard came. It descended without warning, a churning wall of white that swallowed the landscape whole. The wind howled like a thing grieving, driving snow into every crack and crevice of the old cabin. Arthur was trapped, and so were they. He knew they couldn't survive in the cellar. The thought was a burr under his skin, an irritation he couldn't ignore. For hours he tried, stoking his fire, staring into the flames, pretending they weren't there. But the image of the little girl's terrified face was seared into his mind. He saw Martha, for a fleeting, agonizing moment, her face pale against a pillow. He saw the empty cradle he had chopped into firewood. With a curse that was half prayer, half despair, he pulled on his coat, grabbed a lantern, and fought his way back through the storm to the cellar. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. He lowered the lantern into the opening. "You can't stay down there," he yelled over the gale. "You'll freeze." He saw the older girl's silhouette, still defiant. He didn't have the energy for a fight. "I'm leaving the lantern. There's food on the table in the cabin. Come inside or don't. It's your choice." He trudged back, leaving their fate in their own hands. He half expected, half hoped they would remain, proud and stubborn, in their hole. It would absolve him. But 20 minutes later, the cabin door creaked open. They slipped in one by one, silent as ghosts, bringing a gust of snow and the chill of the tomb with them. The eldest, Esther, still held her sharpened stick, though she kept it pointed at the floor. The boy, Caleb, carried the smallest, Ada, who was wrapped in the best of the blankets. They huddled together near the door, as far from him and the fire as they could get, their eyes tracking his every move. Arthur gestured with his head toward the table where he'd left a loaf of bread, a hunk of cheese, and 3 tins of peaches he'd bought in town. He didn't speak. He turned his back on them, giving them the illusion of privacy, and stared into the fire, feeling their presence like a brand on his skin. He heard the scrape of the bench, the soft sound of the bread being torn, the ravenous, near-silent way they ate. The storm raged outside, sealing the 4 of them in an unwilling bubble of warmth and mistrust. The blizzard lasted for 3 days, 3 days of forced proximity in the one-room cabin. The silence of the first night slowly gave way to a strained and fragile truce. Arthur moved about his routine, chopping wood for the fire, melting snow for water. The children watched him, their wariness a constant, silent judgment. He learned their names not because they offered them, but because he heard Esther whisper them. Esther, Caleb, Ada. On the second day, he found Caleb staring intently at the broken hinge on the cabin's lone cupboard. The boy wasn't just looking, he was studying it, his brow furrowed in concentration. Without a word, Caleb picked up a piece of discarded baling wire and, with a focus that seemed too old for his years, began to patiently twist and bend it, fashioning a makeshift repair. Arthur watched him from the corner of his eye, a flicker of something respect, perhaps stirring in his frozen heart. The boy had a mind for mending things. Ada, the youngest, was the first to breach the perimeter of their fear. She would watch him for long stretches, her thumb in her mouth. One afternoon, while he was cleaning his rifle, an act that made Esther tense visibly, Ada toddled over. She stopped a few feet away and simply pointed at the intricate carving of a running deer on the rifle's stock. "Horse," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "Deer," Arthur corrected gruffly, not looking at her. "Deer," she repeated, satisfied. Then she turned and toddled back to the safety of her siblings. It was the first direct interaction, a crack in the ice. The story of their circumstances came out in painful, disjointed pieces, mostly from Esther. Her words were clipped, delivered with a reluctance that made it clear she was giving away secrets she had guarded with her life. Their parents, the Hales, had come west with dreams of wheat fields and a new start. But the land had taken more than it gave. Their father had died in a farming accident the summer before. Their mother, broken-hearted and worn down, had succumbed to lung fever as the first snows of the last winter fell. "She told me to keep us together," Esther said one evening, her voice low and fierce as she stared at the fire. "She said they'd send us away, to different places. She made me promise." So they had hidden. They survived on the last of the pantry stores, on Caleb's snares that sometimes caught a rabbit, on a grit and resilience that stunned Arthur. They hid from the sheriff when he'd come to post the foreclosure notice. They hid from the banker. They hid from everyone, their world shrinking to the confines of the decaying farm, their trust reserved only for each other. Arthur listened, his own grief a silent counterpoint to her tale. He understood loss. He understood the desperate need to hold on to what was left. But his response had been to retreat from the world, to build walls. Hers had been to build a fortress around her brother and sister. He felt a strange, unwelcome pang of shame. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The immediate excuse for their cohabitation was gone. An unspoken question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What now? Arthur found himself unable to say the words, to tell them to leave. The thought of sending them out into that frozen wilderness, or worse, reporting them to the authorities who would surely separate them, felt like a betrayal of some unsworn oath. He looked at Caleb, who was already trying to fix the latch on the woodbox. He saw Ada, asleep by the hearth, her small face peaceful for the first time. He saw Esther, her guard still up, but the exhaustion plain in the slump of her shoulders. "The well pump is likely frozen solid," he said, his voice loud in the quiet cabin. He directed the words at Caleb. Think you can figure out how to thaw it without cracking the iron?" Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes bright with the challenge. A slow nod. Arthur then looked at Esther. "I saw tracks near the north fence line. Coyote. Big one. You need to know how to handle a rifle, not just for hunting." Esther stared at him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and something else, something he couldn't name. But she didn't refuse. And so, a new routine began to form, unspoken and fragile. It was not a family, not yet. It was a partnership of necessity. Arthur taught Esther to shoot, her small frame surprisingly steady as she learned to aim and control her breathing. He taught Caleb about woodworking and mechanics, discovering the boy had a natural, intuitive talent. And Ada, she simply began to attach herself to his orbit, following him as he did his chores, her quiet presence a constant tiny shadow. He found himself buying more food in the small, dusty town of Redemption, a place he usually avoided. He endured the curious stares of the general store owner, Mr. Harris, and the pointed questions he deflected with monosyllabic answers. He bought flour, beans, and a length of blue calico fabric, an impulse buy that he justified by telling himself Ada's dress was more rags than cloth. One evening, he returned to the cabin to find the scent of something other than wood smoke and bacon grease in the air. Esther, using the flour he'd bought, had baked biscuits on the hearthstone. They were a little burnt on the bottom and doughy in the middle, but as they sat around the table, a new, less tense silence settling between them, Arthur ate 3 of them. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling, a feeling he had spent 5 years trying to kill. It felt perilously like hope. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a horse and buggy one sun-drenched afternoon in early spring. The visitor was a man named Elias Donovan, a lay preacher and self-appointed moral guardian of the county. He had a face that seemed permanently pinched in disapproval and a Bible he carried like a weapon. He had heard rumors in town the reclusive Blackwood, who had bought the cursed Hale place, was buying supplies for more than one person. He had come to see for himself. He saw the children playing near the newly repaired porch, Ada laughing as Caleb pushed her on a crude swing he'd built. He saw Esther hanging laundry on a linear boy's patched shirt, a small girl's dress. His eyes narrowed into slits of righteous certainty. "Mr. Blackwood," Donovan began, his voice oozing a condescending piety as Arthur stepped out of the barn. "I have come out of Christian concern. There are whispers in town. It seems you have squatters." "They're not squatters," Arthur said, his voice low and cold. He stood between Donovan and the children, a protective stance he didn't even realize he was taking. Donovan's gaze swept over the scene, missing the mended fences and the clean laundry, seeing only what he wanted to see: impropriety. "They are orphans of the county, sir. It is not right, it is not decent, for them to be here, alone with an unmarried man. It is a matter for the law. They belong in the state orphanage, where they can be properly cared for and instructed in the ways of the Lord." Esther had herded the younger 2 behind her, her face a pale mask of old terror. The word orphanage was a death knell to her. It was the place where promises were broken, where they would be torn apart. "They are cared for," Arthur said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This is their home." "This is a place of ruin and sorrow," Donovan retorted, his voice rising. "And you are not their kin. You have no claim to them. I am reporting this to Sheriff Weston. He will see that order is restored. You can expect a visit from him. It is my duty." He turned his buggy around with a flourish and departed, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The air, which moments before had been filled with Ada's laughter, was now thick with fear. Esther looked at Arthur, her eyes accusing, as if this were all his fault. "He'll take us away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Arthur said, the word a raw vow. "He won't." But as he looked at their frightened faces, he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. The world he had tried so hard to shut out was now battering down his door, threatening to destroy the one thing that had made him feel alive again. The waiting was a quiet agony. For a week, every shadow on the horizon, every distant sound of a horse, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the small cabin. Arthur worked with a grim fury, his movements sharp and angry. He found himself watching the children with a painful intensity, memorizing the way Caleb's face lit up when he solved a puzzle, the way Ada sang tuneless songs to a doll Arthur had carved for her from a block of pine, the way Esther's face would soften, just for a moment, when she looked at her siblings. These small moments, which had begun to patch the holes in his own life, now felt like borrowed time. Esther grew more withdrawn, her old, fierce defensiveness returning. She packed a small bundle of their meager belongings and hid it under her cot, a clear sign that she was ready to run. Caleb became even quieter, his solemn gaze fixed on Arthur, as if trying to gauge whether this man was a rock to cling to or one that would crumble under the pressure. One evening, as Arthur sat cleaning the new calico dress he had clumsily sewn for Ada, Esther finally spoke. "You should just let us go," she said, her back to him. "Before the sheriff comes, we can hide. We're good at hiding." Arthur stopped his work, the needle poised in his calloused fingers. "And where will you go, Esther? It's a hard country. Winter will be back before you know it. You can't live in a root cellar forever." "We survived before," she shot back, whirling to face him, her eyes blazing. "We survived without you." "Yes, you did," Arthur said, his voice softer than he expected. "You did more than survive. You kept them safe. You kept your promise, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Her defiant expression wavered, a hint of the terrified 14-year-old girl showing through the armor. "They'll take us apart. They'll send Caleb to a work farm and Ada to some family in the East. I won't let that happen." "I won't either," he said. The words came from a place so deep inside him he hadn't known it still existed. It was the place where his love for Martha and their lost son was stored, a place of fierce, protective instinct. The inevitable arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Two riders crested the hill, Sheriff Weston, a broad-shouldered man whose face was etched with the weariness of his job, and Elias Donovan, who rode beside him with an air of triumphant vindication. Arthur saw them coming. He told Esther to take the others inside and to keep the door shut. He walked out onto the porch and waited, his feet planted firmly on the wood Caleb had helped him replace. He felt strangely calm. The time for running, for hiding in his grief, was over. "Blackwood," Sheriff Weston greeted him with a nod, dismounting. He had a reputation for being a fair man, but the law was the law. "Donovan here has filed a formal complaint. Says you're keeping the Hale children here against their interests." "Their interest is staying together, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice even, "and staying in their home." "This derelict place," Donovan scoffed from his saddle. "This is no home. It is a den of impropriety. The man is not fit." Sheriff Weston ignored him, his eyes on Arthur. "The law is clear, son. Orphaned children become wards of the county. They're to be placed in the orphanage until a suitable family can be found. You're not family. You have no legal right." The cabin door creaked open. Esther stood there, with Caleb and Ada clinging to her skirt. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She would not hide. The sheriff's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at them. He saw they were not starved or dirty. He saw the new dress on the little one, the mended shirt on the boy. He saw 3 children standing with the man, not behind him in fear. "This man is a stranger, a recluse," Donovan pressed, sensing the sheriff's hesitation. "What do we know of him?" "It is a risk we cannot afford to take with the souls of these innocent children." And at that moment, Arthur Blackwood, the man who had walled himself off with silence, began to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the truth of the last 5 years pour out of him, the words stark and unadorned in the clean autumn air. "I know about loss, Sheriff," he began, his eyes locked on Weston's. 5 years ago, I buried my wife, and I buried my son on the same day. He never took a breath. The confession hung in the air, raw and shocking. Donovan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "After that, Arthur continued, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. The doctor told me there would be no more children. For me, my line ended there. My name would die with me. So I came here. I came here to be alone with that fact. I came here to work until I was too tired to remember what I'd lost. This place, it was meant to be an ending for me. He paused and gestured back toward the cabin, toward the children who were listening, their eyes wide. And then I found them, hiding in the dark, scared and alone, but together. And they interrupted my ending. They brought noise into the silence. They brought need into the emptiness. This boy, he nodded at Caleb, he can fix anything you put in front of him. This girl, he looked at Esther, has more strength and honor in her than any 10 men I've ever met. And the little one, she just needed a safe place to be a child. He took a breath, the confession costing him dearly, but also setting him free. You're right, Sheriff. I have no legal right. I'm not their kin. But I know what it is to be a family and to lose one, and I know that what these children have, right here, is the beginning of one. Don't take that away. Don't send them to a place with walls and numbers just to satisfy your rules. Their home is here, with me. A profound silence followed. Sheriff Weston looked from Arthur's earnest, pain-etched face to the 3 children standing united on the porch. He saw Esther step forward. "We want to stay," she said, her voice clear and strong. He's good. He keeps us safe. He's teaching us. This is our home now." Weston looked at Donovan, whose face was a mask of thwarted righteousness. He then looked back at Arthur. He saw a man who wasn't trying to possess something, but to protect it. He saw a man who had been given a reason to live again. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Donovan, you filed your complaint, and I've investigated it. As far as I can see, these children are fed, they are clothed, and they are not in any immediate danger. In fact, they seem a damn sight better off than when they were hiding in a hole." He turned fully to Arthur. "This is an irregular situation, Blackwood. Very irregular. There will have to be paperwork. I'll have to come by and check on things. But for now, I see no cause to remove them." "Sheriff, this is an outrage," Donovan sputtered. "No, Donovan," Weston said, his voice hardening. "An outrage would be tearing apart the only family these children have left. My job is to protect them, and right now, it looks to me like the best way to do that is to leave them right where they are." He tipped his hat to Arthur. "I'll be in touch." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Donovan fuming in his wake. After a moment of sputtering indignation, the preacher yanked his horse around and followed, defeated. The threat was gone. That evening, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was not the silence of grief or the silence of mistrust. It was the quiet of peace, of a storm past. Arthur sat at the table, carefully sanding the edges of a small wooden horse he was making for Caleb. Esther moved about the room, preparing their meal, not with the tense efficiency of a sentinel, but with the calm grace of someone who belonged. Ada was asleep in her cot, clutching the calico doll, a small smile on her face. Later, after the children were asleep, Arthur stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was a vast sweep of glittering stars, cold and beautiful. He looked up at them and thought of Martha. For the first time, the memory did not bring the familiar, crushing weight of sorrow. It brought a gentle ache, a sad and sweet remembrance. He felt as if he were finally building something worthy of her memory, not just hiding among the ruins of their shared past. The farm was no longer just a place to end, it was a place to begin. The cabin door creaked open behind him. It was Ada, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She padded over to him, not saying a word, and slipped her small hand into his large, calloused one. Her trust was absolute, a gift freely given. Arthur closed his hand around hers, the small fingers, a fragile anchor in the vastness of the night. He looked out at the land, his land, and at the small, sturdy cabin that held his unlikely, precious family. The abandoned farm was no longer abandoned, and neither was he. The year was 1887, and the silence in Esther Hale's cabin was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that had long ago replaced the warm, easy noise of her husband, Walter. Now, dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the gloom, each a tiny planet in a vast, quiet cosmos. The silence was the sound of grief that had settled into the very grain of the wood, the warp of the woven blankets, the cracks in the hard-packed earth floor. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled a lonely ballad across a landscape that was all sharp edges and unforgiving horizons, a land that mirrored the desolation in her own heart. Esther was a widow, a title that felt as ill-fitting and coarse as sackcloth against her skin. In the town of Redemption, a place named for a grace it rarely offered, her status was a brand. She was the woman whose husband had been taken by a fever so swift it had seemed like a judgment. Walter had been a good man, a kind man, but his goodness had not been enough to purchase him more time, nor had it been enough to leave Esther with anything more than this small, isolated plot of land and the crushing weight of memory. The townsfolk treated her with a cloying pity that felt more like contempt, their whispers following her like a flock of carrion birds whenever she ventured in for supplies. They saw a fragile thing, a woman adrift and destined to fail. They did not see the steel wire of resilience that held her together, though even she felt it fraying with each passing day. Her life had shrunk to a cycle of hard, monotonous chores. She rose with the pale, anemic light of dawn, her body aching with a weariness that sleep could not touch. She tended to her meager vegetable garden, coaxing stubborn life from the parched soil. She mended Walter's old shirts, the familiar scent of him long since washed away, leaving only the ghost of a memory. She existed in a state of quiet desperation, a stasis of sorrow from which there seemed no escape. Her world was small, contained within the four walls of her cabin and the rickety fence line that marked the boundary of her solitude. It was a Tuesday when the routine finally broke. The larder was nearly bare, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was a stark reminder of the more profound emptiness in her soul. With a heavy sigh, she pulled her worn shawl around her shoulders, took the small cloth purse containing the last of her money, and began the long, dusty walk into Redemption. The town was buzzing with an unnatural energy, a current of cruel excitement that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. A crowd had gathered in the main square, a tight knot of men whose faces were etched with a kind of leering curiosity. Drawn by a morbid pull she didn't understand, Esther drifted closer. On a makeshift platform stood Garrett Vance, a man whose wealth was built on the misfortunes of others. His smile was a greasy slash in his florid face, and his voice boomed across the square, thick with self-importance. Beside him, in heavy iron chains that bound his wrists and ankles, stood a man. He was a monument to ruin, tall and broad-shouldered. His body was a tapestry of scars, old and new. His face was bruised and cut, his dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. But it was his eyes that captured her. Amid the wreckage of his body, his eyes burned with an unquenched fire, a defiant spirit that refused to be extinguished. He did not cower or plead. He stood with the stillness of a mountain, enduring the jeers and taunts of the crowd with a contemptuous silence that was more powerful than any shout. "A champion fighter," Vance bellowed, yanking on the chain like a man showing off a prized bull. "Ran afoul of some bad debts, but his loss is your gain. Strong back, knows how to handle himself. $10 to start. Who'll give me 10 for this prime specimen?" The crowd laughed. The bids that came were insults. $3, $4. They were bidding on a man's life as if he were a broken mule. A sickness rose in Esther's throat. She saw the town of Redemption for what it was, a place that feasted on the broken, that found sport in humiliation. She saw in the man's chains a reflection of her own invisible bonds of grief, of loneliness, of the town's silent judgment. And then, an impulse, sharp and inexplicable as a lightning strike, shot through her. It was not born of logic or reason. It was an act of pure, unadulterated defiance against Vance. against the sneering faces in the crowd, against the crushing silence of her own life. $5, she said. Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it cut through the din like a razor. The crowd turned as one, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Garrett Vance squinted, his eyes finally landing on the solitary figure of the widow Hale. A slow, incredulous smirk spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, the amusement evident in his tone. "The little church mouse has a roar. $5, she says, going once, going twice." He paused, milking the moment, enjoying her humiliation. "Sold to the widow Hale for the grand sum of $5. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and the crowd joined in. Esther's hand flew to her mouth, the full weight of her reckless act crashing down upon her. She had just spent the last of her money on a broken, dangerous man. Vance roughly unfastened the man's chain from the platform post and tossed a heavy iron key onto the dusty ground at Esther's feet. It landed with a dull thud. "He's all yours, madam. Do try not to get yourself killed." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she bent to retrieve the key, her fingers trembling. The man, whose name she didn't even know, was now her responsibility. As the crowd dispersed, their laughter and whispers trailing behind them, Esther was left standing in the square, facing the stranger she had just bought. She was terrified. The walk back to her cabin was the longest of Esther's life. The man followed a few paces behind her, the clinking of his chains, a grim counterpoint to the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. He did not speak, and she did not dare to look back. The sun beat down on them, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and primal fear. She was acutely aware of his size, of the coiled power in his frame, even in his battered state. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow that flickered across their path, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What had she done? She had invited a wolf into her home, and she had nothing to defend herself with but a fool's hope. When they finally reached the cabin, the sight of its familiar, weathered wood offered little comfort. It seemed smaller, more vulnerable than ever before. She gestured numbly towards the water pump. "You can get a drink," she said, her voice thin and unsteady. He moved to the pump and worked the handle, the muscles in his back bunching and releasing under his torn shirt. He drank deeply, then splashed water over his face and neck, washing away some of the grime. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, a grace that seemed at odds with his brutal profession. Esther stood on the porch, clutching the heavy iron key in her hand. This was the moment of truth. To leave him in chains felt monstrous, a cruelty she could not abide. But to free him, to unshackle this immense, unknown power, it was a terrifying gamble. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold the key steady. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his fiery eyes tracking her every movement. Taking a breath that felt as if it were tearing her lungs, she stepped down from the porch. She walked towards him slowly, holding the key out in her palm, as if it were a peace offering. He did not move. He simply watched her approach, his stillness absolute. She knelt in the dirt before him, a position of supplication that felt utterly wrong, yet necessary. Her fingers fumbled with the rusted lock on his ankle chains. It was stiff and grimy, and for a moment she thought it wouldn't turn. Then, with a grating squeal of protest, the lock clicked open. She moved to his wrists, the iron cold against her trembling hands. The second lock gave way more easily. The chains fell away, pooling in the dust with a heavy clang that seemed to echo in the profound quiet. The man was free. Esther scrambled back, expecting him to flee, or worse, to turn on her. Her mind raced with all the terrible possibilities. He was bigger than her, stronger by far. She had no defense. But he did not run. He did not lunge. Instead, he did something so unexpected it stole the air from her lungs. He slowly, deliberately, sank to one knee in the dirt before her. He lowered his head for a moment, as if in prayer, then raised it. The defiance in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far more potent, an expression of such profound and solemn reverence that it made her heart stop. "My queen," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse but clear and steady. It was not a question nor a plea. It was a statement, a vow. Esther could only stare, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. This beaten fighter, this dangerous stranger, was kneeling at her feet, looking at her as if she were the most powerful person in the world. In that moment, surrounded by the dust and the silence, Esther Hale, the lonely widow of redemption, felt a crack appear in the icy shell of her grief. It was the first tremor of a world beginning to shift on its axis. In the days that followed, a strange and silent rhythm established itself on the small homestead. The man, who had eventually told her his name was Caleb Donovan, spoke very little. Words seemed to be a foreign currency to him, something to be spent with great care. His actions, however, spoke with a clear and unwavering eloquence. He rose before she did, and by the time she emerged from the cabin, a neat stack of freshly chopped firewood would be waiting by her door. He slept on the porch, on a threadbare blanket she had given him, never once attempting to enter the cabin uninvited. He became a sentinel, a silent guardian whose presence was a constant, solid reassurance against the encroaching darkness. He moved about the property with a quiet purpose, his powerful frame, a stark contrast to the delicate work he undertook. He mended the section of fence that had been broken since before Walter's passing. He weeded her struggling garden with a surprising tenderness, his large, scarred hands gentle among the fragile leaves. He even managed to fix the sticking hinge on her front door, a small annoyance that had plagued her for months. Esther watched him, her initial fear slowly giving way to a cautious, bewildered curiosity. He was a puzzle she could not solve. She had seen the raw violence he was capable of in the scars that littered his body, yet he moved through her world with the grace of a penitent. He asked for nothing, expected nothing. He simply worked, his labor a form of silent communication, a steady repayment of a debt only he seemed to understand. Small moments of connection began to stitch together the space between them. One evening, she noticed a fresh tear in his already tattered shirt. Without a word, she took it from him as he washed at the pump, and sat on the porch steps, mending it by the fading light. When she handed it back to him, clean and repaired, he took it and simply held it for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the neatness of her stitches. He said nothing, but a flicker of something gratitude, perhaps something deeper, warmed his dark eyes. The next morning, she found a single, resilient desert primrose, its delicate pink petals, a splash of impossible color, resting on her windowsill. She knew, without needing to be told, that he had placed it there. She brought it inside and put it in a small glass of water, its presence a quiet testament to the strange gentleman who now lived on her porch. They began to share their sparse meals in a companionable silence. At first, she had left a plate for him on the porch steps, but after a few days, he began taking his meal at the far end of the rough-hewn table outside, waiting until she was seated before he would begin to eat. The silence was no longer tense and fearful. It was comfortable, a shared space where words were not necessary. One evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, she found herself speaking of Walter. The words came unbidden, a quiet stream of memory about his easy laugh and the way he had always believed in this unforgiving land. Caleb listened, his expression impassive, but his attention was absolute. He did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. He simply listened, granting her the dignity of her grief, bearing witness to her loss in a way none of the pitying townsfolk ever had. She began to see beyond the fighter. She saw the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, the deep pain that lived behind his stoicism. He was a man who had been terribly broken by the world, yet who had managed to preserve a core of profound honor within himself. Her perception of him shifted entirely. The fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, budding trust. One night, for the first time since his arrival, she went to bed without sliding the heavy bolt across her bedroom door. The knowledge that he was just outside, a silent guardian under the stars, brought her a sense of peace she had not felt in over a year. But while a tentative peace was growing within the bounds of her small property, the town of Redemption festered with suspicion. Her reckless purchase had become a scandal, her cohabitation with the dangerous fighter a source of lurid gossip. The whispers that had once followed her were now bolder, laced with malice and accusation. They did not see an act of kindness, they saw sin, folly, and an invitation to disaster. Garrett Vance, in particular, had not forgotten the humiliation of that day. He had sold a champion for a pittance to a mousy widow, and the injustice of it gnawed at him. Worse still, word had reached him that Esther's property, once neglected, was now showing signs of order and care. The fence was mended, the woodpile high. It was an affront to his sense of order. The man he had owned, his property, was now improving the lot of the very woman who had defied him. One afternoon, the thud of horse hooves broke the quiet rhythm of their day. Vance, flanked by two of his hired thugs, reined in his horse just outside the newly repaired fence line. His eyes swept over the tidy yard, the stack of wood, and the figure of Caleb, who had stopped his work and now stood straight and still, watching them. "Well now, Widow Hale," Vance called out, his voice slick with mock concern. "Just came to see how you were faring. Worried this animal here might have caused you some trouble." He spat on the ground, his gaze dripping with contempt as it fell on Caleb. Esther came to stand on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We are faring just fine, Mr. Vance. We require no assistance from you." Vance's smile turned venomous. "Oh, I think you do. See, that man is my property. I sold him in a moment of generosity, but a deal made with a woman hardly seems binding." He and his men laughed. "I'm thinking I made a mistake. I'm thinking I'll be taking him back." One of his men, a lanky ruffian with a cruel mouth, dismounted and swaggered towards the gate. "Come on now, boy. Time to go." Caleb did not move. He simply stood there, a mountain of silent opposition. "He is not your property," Esther said, her voice shaking but firm. "I paid for him. He is a free man." "Is he now?" Vance sneered. "Let's see what this free man does when we come to collect." The ruffian unlatched the gate and stepped onto the property, reaching for Caleb's arm. In that instant, the quiet penitent vanished and the champion fighter emerged. But it was not the wild, uncontrolled fury of a pit fighter. It was something colder, faster, and infinitely more terrifying. Caleb moved like a blur. One moment the man was reaching for him, the next he was on his back in the dust, gasping for air, his wrist held in a grip of iron. Caleb's other hand shot out, disarming the second man before he could even draw his pistol. He moved with a chilling precision, a ballet of controlled violence. He didn't resort to brutal punches. He used leverage, pressure points, and a speed that was breathtaking. Within seconds, both of Vance's men were disarmed and neutralized, groaning in the dirt. Caleb then turned his cold, flat gaze on Garrett Vance, who sat frozen on his horse, his face pale with shock and fear. Caleb took one step forward. It was all that was needed. Vance yanked on his reins, his horse rearing in panic. He scrambled to get his men, and they retreated in a cloud of dust and humiliation, their threats and curses swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Caleb stood watching them go, his chest rising and falling. Then, the tension bled out of him. He turned back towards the cabin, his eyes finding Esther's. The terrifying warrior was gone, and in his place was the quiet guardian. But something had changed. The line had been drawn. They had been challenged together, and they had stood their ground together. Vance's hatred, meant to tear them apart, had only served to forge their strange alliance into something stronger, something more solid. It was no longer just her home he was protecting, it was theirs. And Esther knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Garrett Vance would be back. The quiet that followed Vance's retreat was heavy with foreboding. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath, the clouds gathering on the horizon in dark, bruised masses. A storm was coming, both in the heavens and on the earth. Esther knew Vance's pride was a venomous thing. He would not let this humiliation stand. He would return, and he would not come for a civil discussion. That evening, the air grew thick and electric. As Esther secured the shutters, Caleb worked methodically around the small cabin, reinforcing a loose board on the door, placing the heavy wood-chopping axe within easy reach of the porch. His silence was no longer one of mere habit. It was the focused quiet of a soldier preparing for battle. He saw the coming threat as clearly as she did. As darkness fell, punctuated by the first distant rumble of thunder, Esther found him standing on the porch, staring out into the gloom. For the first time, she saw a flicker of the old pain in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had fought too many battles. "He will bring more men," she stated, her voice soft but steady. "Yes," Caleb replied, his gaze not leaving the horizon. "Why do you stay?" she asked, the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "You are a free man. You could have been halfway to Colorado by now. Why do this? Why protect me?" He finally turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Because when every other person saw an animal in a cage," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "you saw a man. You paid for my freedom with the last of what you had. In my world, a debt like that is not repaid by running away. It is a blood oath." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was a fighter, yes. Not by choice. I was sold into that life as a boy. I fought for men like Vance, men who owned me, who bet on my blood and my pain. I fought to survive. The only thing I ever truly owned was my word, my loyalty. And I gave it to you." He took a half-step closer, the small space of the porch shrinking until it felt like the whole world. "They called me a champion, but a champion to a king I despised was no honor. I would rather be a soldier for a queen I respect." The simple, profound sincerity of his words washed over her, erasing the last vestiges of her fear and replacing it with a fierce, protective resolve. He was not just a guardian she had stumbled upon. He was her partner in this fight. They were not a widow and a vagrant. They were a household, and they would defend it. "My husband, Walter, he left a shotgun above the hearth," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. "I know how to use it." His eyes held hers, and in that moment, a new and unbreakable pact was sealed between them. They were in this together. The attack came later, under the cover of the raging storm. Rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets, and the wind howled like a thing grieving. Vance, fueled by whiskey and rage, brought 4 men with him this time. They carried torches, their flames sputtering and hissing in the downpour, their intent clear. If they couldn't take the man, they would burn the woman out. Caleb was ready. He met the first 2 men as they burst through the gate. He moved not in the open, but used the darkness and the storm as his allies. He was a shadow, a force of nature as wild as the tempest itself. There was the sickening crunch of bone, a strangled cry swallowed by a clap of thunder. He fought not with the controlled precision he had shown before, but with a desperate, brutal efficiency. This was not a warning. This was a war for survival. From the window, Esther saw a man with a torch nearing the wall of the cabin. Her heart pounded in her throat, but her hands were steady as she lifted the heavy shotgun. The memory of Walter showing her how to aim, his patient voice guiding her, flooded back. She took a deep breath, aimed, and fired. The blast was deafening, a roar that momentarily eclipsed the storm. The man screamed and dropped the torch, which sputtered out in a puddle of mud. Vance, enraged, charged for the porch himself, a long knife gleaming in his hand. Caleb met him head-on. The 2 men crashed together in a frenzy of motion. It was the brute force of Vance against the seasoned skill of Caleb. For a moment, they were locked in a deadly embrace, 2 opposing forces of will. Esther, reloading the shotgun with trembling fingers, watched in horror. She saw Vance's knife arm swing free. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Caleb. Dropping the gun, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and burst out onto the porch, swinging it with all her might. The skillet connected with the side of Vance's head with a sickening thud. His eyes went wide with shock, and his grip on Caleb loosened for just a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Caleb needed. He twisted, using Vance's own momentum against him, and drove him back. Vance stumbled, lost his footing on the slick, rain-soaked wood, and fell from the porch, his head striking the corner of the stone well with a final, definitive crack. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They scattered into the stormy darkness like frightened rats. And then there was silence, a silence more profound than any that had come before, broken only by the sound of the falling rain and their own ragged breaths. The immediate threat was over. The battle was won. Dawn broke, pale and washed clean by the storm. The air was fresh and cool. It found Esther and Caleb on the porch of their battered but standing home. They were bruised, exhausted, and covered in mud, but they were alive. The body of Garrett Vance lay near the well, a grim testament to the night's violence, soon to be a problem for the town sheriff to solve. Esther gently dabbed a cloth soaked in clean water on a cut above Caleb's eye. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on her face as she tended to him. The violence of the night had stripped away all pretense, all barriers between them. What remained was a bond forged in shared peril and absolute loyalty. When she finished, he reached up and gently took the cloth from her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The touch was light, but it sent a current of warmth through her entire being. In the quiet morning light, the horrors of the night receded, leaving behind a hard-won peace. They began to rebuild. They repaired the broken gate, shored up the damaged wall of the cabin, and cleared the debris left by the fight. The sheriff came and went, asking few questions. Vance and his cronies were not well loved, and the town of Redemption, it seemed, was content to let the matter die. The whispers about the widow Hale and her strange companion did not cease entirely, but they changed in tone. Fear and malice were replaced by a grudging, wary respect. Esther and Caleb had faced down Garrett Vance and won. They were no longer seen as a victim and her beast, but as two people who would fiercely defend their own. The homestead began to flourish. Under Caleb's tireless hand, the garden produced a bounty Esther had never thought possible. He built a small, sturdy chicken coop, and soon the sound of clucking hens brought a new and welcome life to the property. The silence that had once been a symbol of Esther's loneliness transformed into a quiet contentment, a shared peace that needed no words. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one not of survival, but of creation. They were building something together, a future carved out of the harsh Wyoming landscape. Several months passed. Autumn painted the sparse plains in shades of gold and russet. Esther was no longer the frail, haunted woman who had walked into town with her last $5. A new light shone in her eyes, a confidence born of knowing her own strength. She was no longer just Walter's widow. She was Esther Hale, mistress of her own domain. Caleb, too, was transformed. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. The scars remained, but they were no longer symbols of a painful past. They were a map of the man who had survived it. One afternoon, she brought a dipper of cool water out to the field where he was turning the soil for the next season's planting. He stopped his work, taking the dipper from her hands, his eyes smiling at her. He drank, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land they now called home. He handed the dipper back to her, his gaze holding hers. The word was unspoken between them now, but it was the foundation upon which their entire world was built. He was her guardian, her partner, her champion, and she, in her simple, profound act of defiant kindness, had become his salvation. She was his queen. Together, in this small, quiet corner of an unforgiving world, they had built a kingdom. It was a kingdom of two, founded not on power or riches, but on the enduring strength of unexpected grace and unbreakable love. And for the first time in a very long time, Esther Hale felt truly, deeply at home.